The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Hollow Creek General Store, and every soul on that dusty Main Street turned to watch as a woman climbed down clutching an infant wrapped in a flour sack blanket, her jaw set like iron even as her eyes told a different story entirely. The year was 1878, and Hollow Creek, Texas, was the kind of town that had seen its share of hard luck and harder people rolling in off the Western Trail. It sat in the belly of a wide valley, where the scrub grass fought the red dirt for dominance, and neither side ever truly won. There was a saloon, a livery, a general store, a small church that had been struck by lightning twice and still stood, and a scattering of homes pressed together along a single main road as if they were afraid of what lay beyond the edges. The railroad had not yet come this far west, though men talked about it the way they talked about the second coming inevitable. They said, just a matter of when. Catherine Dawson was 24 years old, and she looked like she had walked the last 100 miles rather than ridden them. Her brown hair was pinned back in a loose knot at the base of her neck, and the hem of her gray traveling dress was caked in the particular red dust that coated everything in this part of Texas. She had a carpet bag in one hand and the infant in the crook of her other arm, and she stood in the middle of that street like a woman who had already made her decision and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. The baby made a small sound against her chest, and she pressed her lips to the top of its head without even thinking about it. That small gesture, that instinctive tenderness, was noticed by exactly one person watching from the covered porch of the feed store across the road. Silas Weston had been in Hollow Creek for 3 years by then. He had come from the hill country after his father's land had been parceled off to settle debts, and he had built himself something solid in this valley with nothing but 2 hands and a stubbornness that his mother had always said would either save him or bury him. He ran a small cattle operation on the east side of the valley, hired 2 good ranch hands, and kept mostly to himself in the way of men who have been disappointed enough times that solitude starts to feel safer than company. He was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a permanent squint from years of reading the sun and the horizon for weather. He was not an unfriendly man. He was simply careful. He watched Catherine Dawson stand in the street with that baby, and he felt something shift in his chest, the way the ground sometimes shifts just before the deeper rumblings follow, and he told himself it was simply curiosity. A strange woman in a small town was always worth noting. That was all. She walked to the general store, and he watched her go, and then he went back to loading his wagon with the fence posts he had come to town for. He had 30 head of cattle that needed proper fencing on the north pasture before the weather turned, and he had no business standing on a porch staring at strangers. Inside the general store, Catherine set her carpet bag on the wooden floor and shifted the baby to a better position against her shoulder. The proprietor, a round-faced man named Gerald Purcell with mutton-chop whiskers and an expression of permanent mild suspicion, looked at her over the counter. "Help you," he said. "I am looking for work," Catherine said. Her voice was clear and steady, the accent carrying traces of something east of here, maybe Missouri, maybe further. "Anything honest. Cooking, cleaning, mending. I am good with accounts if someone needs books kept. I have a reference letter from a family I worked for in Abilene." Gerald Purcell looked at the baby. "That yours?" "She is in my care," Catherine said, and left it at that. The proprietor's expression did not exactly soften, but it shifted into something more considering. Ada Carmichael over at the boarding house might need help in the kitchen. She was just complaining Sunday about her back again. He paused. She might not take to the baby. "I will speak with her," Catherine said. He gave her directions, and she picked up her bag and walked back into the afternoon heat. The baby had fallen asleep, little chest rising and falling with that absolute trust that only the very young can manage, and Catherine kept her hand curved around the small, warm weight of her and walked down the street toward the boarding house. She passed the feed store just as Silas Weston was lifting the last of the fence posts into his wagon. He glanced at her the way a man does when he is pretending not to look, and she walked past without acknowledgement, the way a woman does when she has learned that anonymity is a form of armor. She got the job at the boarding house. Ada Carmichael was a widow of 60 with silver hair and a back that had been troubling her for the better part of 2 years, and she ran her establishment with a firm sense of propriety that had not yet tipped over into cruelty. She looked at Catherine for a long moment, and then she looked at the baby, and she said, "Is there a husband coming?" "No," Catherine said. "Is there trouble coming?" Catherine met her eyes. "I do not believe so." Ada studied her. "What is the child's name?" "Rose," Catherine said. "Her name is Rose. How old?" 8 weeks. Ada nodded slowly, some private calculation running behind her eyes. "You will have a room in the back, small, but it is private. You will work breakfast service and supper, clean the common rooms, do the mending as needed. I will pay you $4 a month plus room and board for both of you. The baby must not disturb my boarder's sleep." "She is a good baby," Catherine said. "She rarely cries at night." "They all rarely cry until they do," Ada said dryly, but there was something almost fond in it. "Come on then, I will show you the room." The room was small, as promised, with a narrow iron bed, and a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window that looked out at the alley between the boarding house and the saddle maker's shop next door. Catherine set her carpet bag on the bed and stood in the middle of the small space and breathed in the particular smell of old wood and lye soap, and she told herself that this was fine. This was more than fine. This was a roof and a purpose and a safe place for Rose to sleep, and that was everything that mattered. She did not let herself think about Alina, because if she started thinking about Alina, she would not be able to stop, and she could not afford to come apart in a stranger's town with a baby depending on her. She washed her face in the basin, changed Rose, fed her with the small bottle she had been carrying, and went to help Ada with supper. The boarders that first night were 4 men, 2 cattle buyers passing through, an older schoolteacher named Mr. Hatch who had been living at Ada's for 2 years, and Silas Weston, who boarded there through the winter months when the ranch house got too cold and the work allowed for it. Catherine came through the kitchen door carrying the bread, and she stopped for just a fraction of a second when she saw Silas already seated at the table, because she recognized him from the street, not from anything specific he had done, but simply because she had catalogued every face she passed in every new town out of a habit born of caution. He looked up at the same moment, and there was a brief recognition that passed between them, stranger to stranger, before she set the bread on the table and went back to the kitchen. He watched the kitchen door swing closed behind her and thought again that he had no reason to be curious about a woman he did not know. He had ample reason, as it turned out. Over the following days, Hollow Creek did what small towns do, which was talk. The talking was not vicious, not at first. It was simply the currency of people who lived in close proximity to one another, and had limited entertainment beyond weather and one another's business. What they knew was this: a young woman had come to town with a baby that appeared to be too light-skinned to be entirely hers given her own coloring, though the truth was more complicated than anyone realized. She had no husband, no family visible, no explanation forthcoming. What Catherine had, and what Ada came to recognize within the first week, was an extraordinary capacity for quiet dignity and hard work. She was at the stove before dawn. She kept the common room spotless. She mended with the tiny, even stitches of someone who had been taught properly, and she managed the accounts Ada had been letting slide with a quick, clean hand. She moved through the boarding house like someone who understood the relationship between being useful and being allowed to stay. Rose slept in a dresser drawer padded with a blanket, which was a common enough practice for infants in 1878, and she was, as Catherine had promised, a remarkably peaceful baby. She had dark hair and very dark eyes and a small solemn expression that made Mr. Hatch, the schoolteacher, say that she looked like a philosopher. Silas ate his meals at Ada's table and watched Catherine with the kind of careful attention he gave to things that confused him, which was to say he tried very hard not to let it show. He noticed things against his will. He noticed that she never sat down to eat until everyone else was settled, and she was sure nothing else was needed. He noticed that she always checked on the baby between courses, a quick quiet step to the back room and back, light on her feet and unobtrusive. He noticed that when Mr. Hatch told a long rambling story about his years teaching in Missouri, Catherine listened with genuine interest and asked questions that were more intelligent than the story deserved. On the fifth day, they spoke properly for the first time. It was evening, after supper had been cleared and Ada had gone upstairs and the other boarders had drifted to the saloon or their rooms. Catherine was sitting on the back steps of the boarding house with Rose on her lap, watching the last of the daylight pull back behind the hills. Silas came around the side of the building with his hat in his hand, heading toward the small stable where he kept his horse when he was in town, and he stopped when he saw her. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she said. He stood there a moment with that hat turning in his hands, which was not something he would have admitted he did, and then he said, "She doing all right?" "The little one." Catherine looked down at Rose, who was awake and regarding the sky with the same philosophical expression Mr. Hatch had noted. "She is," Catherine said. "She likes the evening air, I think." He came a few steps closer, near enough to be in the conversation but not so close as to intrude on whatever small private moment this was. "How old is she?" "Nearly 10 weeks now." Catherine smoothed her thumb across Rose's cheek, a gesture so natural it clearly came from somewhere deep in her. "She is growing fast." Silas looked at the baby and then back at Catherine, and he said, "I am Silas Weston. I have a ranch on the east side of the valley." "I know," she said. "Ada pointed you out my first evening. She made a point of telling me the occupations of all her boarders." She paused. "I am Catherine Dawson." "I know," he said, and there was a small warmth in saying it back to her that made her mouth curve just slightly. "Sit down if you want," she said, gesturing at the step beside her, because she was tired and the evening was beautiful and she had been surrounded by people all day in a way that required performance, and Silas Weston did not seem to require performance. "Unless you are in a hurry." He sat down on the step, leaving a proper distance between them, and turned his face up toward the sky where the first stars were appearing. "You come from Abilene?" he asked. "Before that St. Louis," she said. "Before that further east. You are moving west." "I suppose I am." "Most people going west are moving toward something," he said. "A few are moving away. It is usually pretty obvious which is which." She looked at him with an expression that was partly surprised and partly amused. "Which do you think I am?" He considered her with that careful squint. "I think you are both," he said. "I think whatever you are moving away from turned into something you are moving toward, and the baby is part of that." She was quiet for a moment, and Rose made a small sound that was not quite a word and not quite nothing, and Catherine said, "You are perceptive, Mr. Weston." "Silas," he said. "Silas," she agreed, and the word settled easily, as if it had been said many times before. They sat in the gathering dark for another half hour, and they talked about nothing of consequence. The weather coming in off the mountains, the price of beef, whether Ada's cat had always been so large or whether it had recently acquired that distinction. Easy things, surface things. But there was a quality to the ease that was not superficial at all. A quality of two people who have each, separately, lived through enough that they can recognize a similar weight in someone else and feel something like relief at the recognition. When the night came fully, Catherine stood and lifted Rose to her shoulder. "Thank you for the company," she said. "Good night, Silas." "Good night, Catherine," he said, and he watched her go inside, and then he stood in the dark for another minute before going to see to his horse. The weeks that followed had the quality of something building slowly, the way a good fire builds from careful tending rather than a single dramatic striking of a match. Silas began finding reasons to linger after supper. Catherine began setting his coffee cup down first, which was not protocol but was not spoken of either. They talked. They talked about more each time, spiraling gradually inward from the surface of things. the way honest conversation does when it is allowed to proceed at its own pace without pressure. He learned that she had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of a seamstress and an accountant who had both died of cholera when she was 17, and that she had made her way west in the company of a family from her church who had taken her on as a nursemaid to their 4 children. She had eventually found her footing in Abilene working as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant named Mr. Prentice, who ran an honest business and treated her well. She had been there 2 years before Eleanor. Eleanor was the part Catherine did not tell him yet, not the full version. He learned that she was quick with numbers in a way that pleased her abstractly, that she had a taste for strong coffee and a distaste for meanness in any form, that she told stories with a dry, precise humor that could catch you off guard, and that she sang softly to Rose in the evenings in a low, clear voice that he sometimes heard through the thin walls of the boarding house when he was passing down the hall, and that it did something to his chest that he had stopped pretending was nothing. She learned about him more gradually because he was slower to speak, but she was patient. She learned that he had come from the hill country after his father's death, that the land he had grown up on was gone, that he had spent 2 years working other men's cattle before he had saved enough to start his own herd. She learned that he was scrupulously honest in the way of men who have had something taken from them unjustly and are determined never to take from others in turn. She learned that he loved this valley in the unsentimental, practical way of a man who knows every waterway and rise of it, who can read its weather and its moods, who has chosen it as his in the fullest sense of the word. She learned that there was a gentleness in him that he wore quietly, the way some men wear fine things, only those paying attention would notice. In early October, 6 weeks after her arrival, something happened that changed the texture of the situation entirely. A man rode into Hollow Creek on a buckskin horse, and he asked around about a woman traveling alone with a baby. His name was Foster Dawes, and he was from Abilene, and he had the kind of face that smiled frequently without any warmth reaching his eyes. Ada told Catherine about him that evening, quietly, while the boarders were at supper. Catherine went still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. She set down the pot she was holding very carefully. "What did he look like?" she asked. Ada described him. Catherine nodded slowly. "Did he say why he was looking?" "He said it was family business." Ada's voice was dry. "He did not look like family to me." "No," Catherine said, "he would not." She came out to supper and served the meal and was exactly as composed as she always was. But Silas watched her the way he watched the sky when the pressure was changing and the clouds were moving wrong, and he knew something was moving wrong. He caught her in the kitchen doorway after supper when the others had gone. "Tell me," he said simply. She stood with her hands folded in front of her and looked at him for a long moment, and then she made a decision he could see cross her face. "Sit down," she said. "It is a long story." He sat at the kitchen table, and she poured them each coffee, and she told him about Eleanor. Eleanor Page had been 20 years old and unmarried and working at the laundry in Abilene when Catherine had known her. She was a sweet-natured and somewhat naive girl from a farm family in Kansas who had come to Abilene with grand ideas about independence and found instead the grinding reality of 12-hour workdays and a city that did not extend much kindness to young women alone. Catherine had taken a liking to her, the same way you take a liking to something fragile that is trying very hard to be strong, and she had become something of a protective presence in Eleanor's life. Foster Dawes had been Eleanor's employer. He ran the laundry, and he was a man who used his position the way men of his type did, which was as leverage over the women who needed the work. Eleanor had been afraid of him. Catherine had seen it and had spoken to Eleanor about it, and Eleanor had said she could handle it. And then 3 months later Eleanor had come to Catherine's door at midnight with the news that she was expecting. She would not say it outright, Catherine said, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup. But I knew. He was the only man she had been near, and she did not have the look of someone who had chosen something, She had the look of someone something had been done to. Silas said nothing. His jaw was tight. She had no one. Her family would not take her back. She was certain of it. The shame, she kept saying, the shame of it. I told her there was no shame, that the shame belonged entirely to the man who had done this, but she could not hear that. She was terrified. Catherine's voice was steady and precise, the way people get when they have turned a story over in their minds so many times it has worn smooth. She carried the baby to term. Rose was born in March. Alina died 3 days after. He let the silence sit for a moment. "I am sorry," he said, and he meant it in the full weight of the words. "Childbed fever," Catherine said. "It was quick, at least. The doctor said she likely felt very little at the end." She looked down at the cup. "Before she died, she made me promise. She asked me to take Rose somewhere safe, somewhere Foster Dawes could not find her, because he had come around when Alina started showing and had made it very clear that the baby was an inconvenience and he would see to it." "See to it," Silas said flatly. His exact words. Catherine's eyes came up to meet his. "I do not know what he intended. I did not stay to find out. I left Abilene 2 weeks after Alina died with Rose and everything I owned, and I have been moving west." "And he has followed you," Silas said. "Apparently not until now. I thought perhaps he had given up the idea, whatever his idea was." She set the coffee cup down. "I am not Rose's mother by blood. Alina was her mother. I am just the woman who made a promise." Silas looked at her across the table. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment, and then he said, "That is not just anything, that is everything." She blinked just once, something shifting in her expression. "You are the person who showed up," he said. "That is what a mother is." Catherine looked away, and he could see her composing herself, pulling something tight that had started to loosen. "I do not know what he wants," she said. "I do not know if it is Rose specifically, or whether it is me he is angry with for leaving." "It does not matter which," Silas said. "He is not getting either one." He said it so simply, so flatly, with no drama in it at all, that it had the quality of something already decided rather than something being promised. She looked back at him. "You do not owe me anything, Silas." "No," he agreed. "I do not owe you anything. This is just the right thing." He left shortly after, and she sat in the kitchen for a while with the lamp burning low and Rose sleeping in the back room. And she felt something she had not felt since leaving Abilene, which was that she was not entirely alone in this. The next morning, Silas spoke with Sheriff Tom Briggs, a lean, taciturn man of 50 who wore his badge with the resignation of someone who had wanted to be something else and somehow ended up here. He told the sheriff about Foster Dawes, not all of it, but enough. That a man had come to town asking after a woman and a baby, that there was reason to believe his intentions were not friendly, that the sheriff should know he was in the county. Tom Briggs scratched his jaw. "Can't run a man off for asking questions," he said. "No," Silas agreed, "but you can keep an eye on who is asking and what they do next." The sheriff said he would. Silas then went to the boarding house and had a quiet word with Ada, who listened with her arms folded and her eyes sharp, and said, "I already told him nothing, and I would have told him less if I could have managed it." She paused. "Is Catherine in danger?" "I do not think it will come to that," Silas said, "but it is better to know than not." Ada looked at him with an expression that said several things she chose not to put into words. "You are spending a good deal of attention on my kitchen help," she said. "Ada," he said, and there was a slight warning in it, but also something else, and Ada heard the something else perfectly clearly and said nothing more. Foster Dawes remained in Hollow Creek for 3 days. He ate at the saloon and drank somewhat, and he asked questions of people who gave him very little, because small towns protect their own quickly when the circumstances present themselves clearly. And the circumstances here were presenting themselves as a man with cold eyes looking for a woman and a baby, which no one in Hollow Creek found admirable. He came to the boarding house once, knocked on the front door, and Ada answered it and said with complete composure that she had no single women boarding with her, and that she was full up besides. And she closed the door on him with a gentle firmness that left no room for argument. On the third day, Silas went to the saloon in the late afternoon and found Foster Dawes at a corner table. He was not looking for a confrontation. He was simply making a calculation. He pulled out the chair across from Dawes and sat down, and Dawes looked at him with those flat, unreflective eyes. "You are in Hollow Creek looking for someone," Silas said quietly. "I am going to save you some time. The woman you are looking for and the child in her care are under the protection of this community and specifically under mine. There is nothing here for you." He held the man's gaze. "I would suggest the Eastern Road in the morning." Dawes studied him for a long moment. He was not a coward, but he was a calculator, and what he was calculating now was the size of Silas Weston and the quality of the stillness in him, which was the stillness of a man who does not make threats he is not prepared to see through, and he was calculating the lack of any ally in the room, and he was calculating how much Rose Page was worth to him against these variables. "The baby has legal ties," Dawes said. "I could make a claim." "On what basis?" Silas said. It was not a question. It was an invitation to think very carefully. Dawes said nothing. "The child's mother is dead," Silas said. "She left the child in the care of the woman raising her. There is nothing here for you." He stood up. "Morning stage goes east at 7. He walked out of the saloon, and the next morning the buckskin horse was gone from the livery and Foster Dawes with it, and Silas stood on the porch of the boarding house drinking his coffee and watching the road east and said nothing about it to anyone. Catherine found out through Ada, who had seen the horse go from her upstairs window. She came to find Silas in the stable where he was grooming his horse, and she stood in the doorway with Rose against her shoulder, and she said, "What did you say to him?" He kept his attention on the horse's flank. "I told him there was nothing here for him. And he believed you." "He believed the math," Silas said. "He was looking for something easy. This was not easy." She watched him for a moment. Rose made a small reaching motion toward the horse, and Silas noticed and came to stand near them. And he let the horse drop its big head, and Rose's small hand touched the soft nose, and Rose made a sound of pure delight that was unlike any sound she had made before. The first real laugh nearly, the beginning of it, and both of them heard it at the same moment, and both of them looked at her, and then at each other. It was the first time they smiled at exactly the same thing at exactly the same moment, and the warmth of it was almost startling. "Thank you," Catherine said. "For what you did, for all of it." "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I want to," she said. "It matters that someone that you—" She stopped and recollected herself. "It matters." "I know," he said quietly. The horse nudged Rose's hand again, looking for more attention, and Rose obliged with a small, delighted sound, and Catherine laughed, a short, genuine laugh that transformed her face completely, and Silas thought he had never seen anything so worth looking at in all his 30 years. November came in cold and blue and sharp-edged, and Hollow Creek settled into its winter patterns. Silas was at the ranch more now, working the land against the cold, fencing and mending and preparing his stock for the season. He came to Ada's for supper 3 or 4 nights a week instead of every night, and Catherine noticed the difference in the way you notice when a familiar warmth has moved slightly away, not dramatically, just enough to register. He always noticed when she was quieter than usual, and she noticed when he was tired from the cold work. They had arrived at a friendship that was thorough and genuine, and full of the small, detailed knowledge that comes only from sustained attention, and both of them were becoming aware that the word friendship was not quite big enough to contain what this was anymore. On a Thursday evening in mid-November, Silas arrived for supper with a bruised hand from a fence post that had come loose badly, and Catherine saw it when she was pouring his coffee, and she did not think. She simply took his hand and turned it in the lamplight to assess the damage with a focused practicality that was also somehow extremely gentle. He went entirely still. She examined the bruised knuckles and said, "You should put cold water on this tonight and arnica in the morning if Ada has any." "She does," he said, in a voice that was not quite his normal voice. Catherine looked up and found his eyes very close and looking at her with an expression she recognized in the way you recognize something you have been reading in peripheral vision for weeks and are only now meeting directly. She let go of his hand carefully and stepped back and went to serve the rest of the table, and for the remainder of supper they were both excessively polite and entirely conscious of every movement. After supper, he found her in the kitchen. "Catherine," he said. "I know," she said, not looking up from the dishes. "Do you?" She turned around then. She leaned back against the kitchen counter and looked at him and said, "I think I have known for some time. I have been trying to be sensible about it." "And is that working?" he asked, and there was the slightest softness in it. "Not particularly," she said. He took 2 steps and then stopped himself, and she could see him working through something, and she waited because she had learned his silences. "I need to say something, and I need you to hear it plainly," he said. "Not as a courtesy, as the truth." "All right," she said. "Rose does not change this," he said. "Whatever you might think I should be feeling about the situation, the baby, the circumstances, it does not change a single thing. She is part of you. The two of you are not a complication to me." He held her gaze steadily. "I want to be clear about that before anything else." Catherine looked at him, and she felt something break open in her chest, not painfully, but in the way that something breaks open when it has been held under pressure for too long, a release rather than a rupture. "She is not mine by blood," Catherine said, the words coming out with a quality of confession, though she did not mean them that way. "She is yours every way it counts," Silas said firmly. "And even if she weren't, it would not change a single thing about how I feel. The child does not complicate this. The child is part of what I admire." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her measuring the words, checking them for the kind of conditional generosity that says all the right things and means something smaller, and he let her look because he had nothing to hide in any of it. "You are a good man, Silas Weston," she said finally. "I try to be," he said. "Is that enough to begin with?" She smiled then, the full real smile that he had been collecting glimpses of for months. "Yes," she said, "I think it is more than enough." He crossed the remaining distance and he took her hand, the one that had been holding the dish towel, and he held it between both of his with a care that was almost reverent, and they stood in Ada's kitchen while the wind came down off the hills and rattled the window glass, and it was perfectly, entirely clear that something had been decided. They were not reckless about it. That was not the nature of either of them. What followed was a courtship conducted with all the decorum that 1878 in a small Texas town required, which meant that Silas escorted Catherine to church on Sunday mornings and carried Rose through the cold in the big canvas coat he wore. And they sat together in the third pew, and Hollow Creek observed this and drew its conclusions. He took her on a ride out to the East Valley on a clear December day, bundled Rose into the wagon between them with every blanket Ada owned, and showed her the ranch, the house he had built from the ground up with those 2 hands, the cattle that moved like slow copper shapes across the winter-brown grass, the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property and ran clear even in dry months. She stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked out at the valley in its winter colors, the bleached grass and the dark green of the scrub cedar and the pale sky, and she said, "You built this." "Every board," he said, standing beside her with his arms folded against the cold. "It is beautiful," she said, and she meant the land and the house and the work of it, and he heard all 3 meanings. "It needs more," he said. "It needs a kitchen garden in the spring. The parlor needs curtains. The north room has been empty since I built it because I built it for eventually." He stopped. She looked at him. "I built it for a family," he said plainly. "I am 30 years old and I built this place with that in mind, and I have just been waiting for the right." He turned and looked at her. "You could have things here, Catherine. You and Rose could have a real home here." She was quiet for a moment, the wind moving a loose strand of her hair, her eyes on the valley. "Are you asking me something, Silas?" "Not yet," he said, and there was a warmth in it that was also a promise. "When I ask you, it will be properly asked. I just want you to know that it is coming." She turned to look at him with those steady, clear eyes and something close to wonder in them. "All right," she said softly. "I will be ready for it." He asked her on Christmas Eve. Ada had made a small celebration of it in the boarding house, with a pine bough over the mantel and a candle in every window, which was her tradition. The boarders had thinned out. The cattle buyers were long gone. Mr. Hatch had gone east to visit family, and it was only Silas and old James Pryor who worked at the bank, and Ada and Catherine and Rose. They had a quiet supper and Ada's excellent apple cake, and afterward Ada and James played cards at the parlor table and Catherine sat near the fire with Rose sleeping in her arms, the baby's face lit gold and peaceful in the firelight. Silas sat across from her. He had been quiet all evening, and she had noticed, and she had let him be quiet. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, small and plain, a thin gold band with a tiny dark red stone, garnet, the stone his mother had worn. He had been carrying it from the hill country all this time. He leaned forward in his chair and held it out across the small distance between them, and he said, "Catherine Dawson, will you marry me? You and Rose, both of you as a family. That is what I am asking." She looked at the ring and then at his face and then at Rose sleeping in her arms, and she said, in a voice that was very clear and very certain, "Yes, Silas, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger carefully, mindful of the sleeping baby, and Ada looked up from her cards and said, without any pretense of surprise, "Well, it is about time," and James Pryor laughed and dealt the next hand. They were married in February of 1879, in the small church that had been struck by lightning twice and still stood, and it seemed appropriate. Reverend Aldous Cole performed the ceremony with a grave warmth, and Ada stood up for Catherine, and Silas's ranch hand Moses Tremaine, a quiet, wide-shouldered man of 40 who had ridden with Silas from the hill country, stood up for Silas. Rose was present in Ada's arms, dressed in the white cotton dress Ada had sewn her, and she regarded the proceedings with her philosophical expression, and then fell asleep precisely at the moment Reverend Cole said the words that made them a family. The winter was still hard, but Catherine moved into the ranch house with Silas and began the slow, careful work of making it fully a home. She planted the kitchen garden when the earth softened in March, and she got the curtains up in the parlor, white cotton trimmed with a small blue pattern, and Silas came inside one evening after the long work of the day and stood in the parlor doorway and looked at the curtains and at Catherine rocking Rose by the window, and he thought that a person could live inside a moment like this for a long time and not want for anything. Rose was walking by summer, or something close to walking, a determined staggering progress from one piece of furniture to the next that made both of them follow her around the parlor with their arms slightly out, ready to catch. She had Aliner's dark eyes and dark hair, and she was already fierce and curious in a way that delighted Silas, who would get down on the floor with her and let her examine his hat and his boots and the various items of ranch life that came into the house on him. And Catherine would watch this and feel something she did not have words for, something that was equal parts joy and grief and profound gratitude. She told Silas about Aliner more fully that summer, on a warm evening when they were sitting on the porch watching Rose move carefully through the grass on her hands and knees after a beetle. She told him about Aliner's laugh and the way she had always hummed while she worked, and the fact that she had wanted to be a teacher, had been reading books toward it in the evenings, had talked about it the way people talk about something they are not sure they are allowed to want. She told him about the last conversation she had had with Aliner, which had been about Rose, just Rose, Aliner holding the baby she was too weak to nurse and saying, "She will be something, I can feel it. She is already something." She told him that she carried Aliner with her every day and that loving Rose did not feel like losing Aliner but like keeping her. Silas sat beside her and listened to all of it, and when she was finished he said, "Then Rose will know her. We will make sure she knows who her mother was." Catherine looked at him. "How?" "We will tell her," he said simply. "When she is old enough to understand, we will tell her about Aliner, her name, her laugh, what she wanted to be." Rose will know that she came from a woman who loved her enough to ask the right person to keep her safe. He paused. That is not a small thing to know about yourself. Catherine pressed the heels of her hands to her eyes for a moment, not crying, just steadying herself against something large. You are a good man, she said, the same words she had said in Ada's kitchen that November evening. You keep saying that, he said. I keep meaning it, she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and Rose looked up from the grass and found them there and waved one small hand with the expression of someone bestowing a great favor, and they both laughed. The summer of 1879 passed in the good, productive way of seasons on a working ranch, full of labor and small pleasures, and the particular satisfaction of a life that is growing in the right direction. Silas's herd had increased to 60 head, and he was hiring a second permanent hand, a young man of 19 named Cal Briggs, who was the sheriff's nephew, and who was learning everything with the earnest focus of someone desperate to prove himself. Catherine's kitchen garden had done well: beans and squash and tomatoes and herbs that she dried and hung from the rafters in the kitchen, making the room smell like summer even in autumn. She had also, quietly, begun keeping books for two other businesses in Hollow Creek, Gerald Purcell at the general store and the feed merchant down the road. She had a gift for the work, for the clean logic of columns and figures, and both men paid her fairly and told others. And by September she had 3 regular clients and a small independent income that gave her a satisfaction she would not have been able to fully explain to anyone who had never had to depend entirely on another person's goodwill for their survival. Silas saw it in her, the way she stood a little differently on the days she had come back from Purcell's store with her account ledger under her arm and money in her pocket that was entirely her own. He said nothing about it, only asked her once how the books were looking, and she talked through Purcell's inventory problems with precision and pleasure, and he listened and asked questions and took nothing of it away from her, and she loved him for that in a specific and considered way. She loved him in many ways by now. She loved the way he was with the land, the respect in it, the way he could read weather and water and animal behavior with a fluency that was almost a language. She loved the way he was with Rose, thorough and gentle and genuinely delighted by her, not performatively, not the way some men are with children because they feel they should be, but in the real laughing way of someone who finds a small person's view of the world genuinely illuminating. She loved his silences, which were never sullen but always full, the silences of a man who is present. She loved that he had told her once, early in their marriage, that he had never thought of himself as the kind of man to have much, and that he said it now in a voice so different from the first telling that she understood it to mean something had changed. She told him she loved him on an October evening, standing in the kitchen after supper while Rose was already asleep in her room, just the two of them in the lamplight, and it came out in the middle of a perfectly ordinary sentence about whether they needed more flour from the store, which was not how she had imagined saying it, but his face when she said it made everything about the circumstances entirely irrelevant. He put down the cup he was holding and turned to face her fully and said, I have been in love with you since the night you told me to sit down on Ada's back steps and shared the evening air with me like it was perfectly normal to offer a stranger that kind of peace. She stared at him. That was the second week. Yes, he agreed. You waited a long time to say it. I wanted to be sure you knew what I was before I said it, he said. Some things you can only say once and have them mean what they should. I wanted to be sure. She crossed the kitchen and she put her arms around him and pressed her face to the warm, solid place between his shoulder and his neck, and he held her there in the kitchen with the lamp burning low and the night outside, and she thought that Alina had asked her to take Rose somewhere safe, and she had not quite understood, when she left Abilene, how large that word safe could become. In November of 1879, Catherine discovered she was expecting. She told Silas on a Sunday morning before church, standing in the kitchen in the early light, and she watched his face go through several things in quick succession: surprise, calculation, joy, something very close to overwhelmed. And then he crossed the room and held her face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that said everything that words were not quite sufficient for. Rose was nearly 2 by then, and she had no particular awareness of the significance of any of this. But she had a very strong awareness that both her parents were acting strangely, and that there were more hugs than usual, which suited her entirely. The pregnancy was healthy, and the winter was manageable, and spring came back to the valley with all the wild color it always brought, the bluebonnets running across the lower pasture in waves, and the creek running full and cold and bright. Catherine's garden went in earlier that year, Silas doing the heavier digging while she directed, which she had opinions about and expressed them clearly, and he dug where she pointed and kept his amusement to himself. Cal Briggs had become a good ranch hand, dependable and increasingly skilled, and Moses Tremaine taught him with the patient exactness of a man who has learned his trade from the ground up and understands what a solid foundation is worth. The ranch was running well. The 60 head had become 75, and Silas had his eye on a piece of property on the northern edge of the valley, an additional 50 acres with good water access, that would allow him to increase the herd to something genuinely sustainable over the long term. Ada Carmichael had taken to coming out to the ranch on Sunday afternoons, a habit that had developed over the winter and showed no sign of stopping. She would come in her good gray dress in the buggy that Gerald Purcell loaned her, and she and Catherine would sit in the parlor and talk about nothing and everything, while Silas and Rose conducted operations in the yard that generally involved a great deal of dirt and the patient participation of whatever ranch animal could be persuaded to cooperate. Ada had never had children. She had been married at 20 to a man who had died of fever before their second anniversary, and she had built her life around her boarding house and her community, and she was not a woman who spoke easily about grief or longing. But she watched Rose with a quality of attention that Catherine recognized, and one Sunday she reached over and took Ada's hand without saying anything, and Ada sat very still for a moment and then squeezed back and said, "She is remarkable, that child." "She is," Catherine agreed. "She has a leaner's eyes," Ada said, and then looked slightly surprised at herself because she had heard the story but had not spoken the name before. "She does," Catherine said. "I am glad you can see that. I want people to see it." Ada nodded. "She will know who she came from." "She will know all of it," Catherine said. "We decided that from the beginning." In July of 1879, the matter of Foster Dawes resolved itself in a way that brought an unexpected peace to something that had been sitting at the edge of Catherine's awareness since his visit the previous fall. A letter came to her via Gerald Purcell, who received the mail, forwarded from a contact in Abilene. A woman who had known Alina and who wrote to say that Foster Dawes had been arrested in Abilene in the spring on charges related to his conduct toward women in his employ, that he had been tried, that he had been convicted and sentenced to 5 years in the state penitentiary, and that several other women had come forward once the first charge was made. Catherine sat with that letter for a long time. She sat on the porch steps, the same steps where she and Silas had first talked, and she read it twice, and then she set it in her lap and looked out at the dusty main street of Hollow Creek and thought about Alina. She thought that Alina had not been the only one, and that the ones who came after Alina had done something Alina herself had not been able to do, and she was not sure what to do with that, with the sharp grief and the complicated relief of it, and she sat there until Silas came and sat beside her, close this time, no proper distance needed any more. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. He set it down. "He will not come back," he said. "No," she said, "and he will answer for what he did to Alina." "Something close to it," she said. "Not everything, but something." He put his arm around her and she leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat together in the afternoon sun, and the grief for Alina was still real and still present, but it was carried differently now between two people instead of one, and that made it something that could be held rather than something that would overwhelm. The baby was born on the 5th of August, 1880 in the early morning hours, with Dr. Fletcher present and Ada assisting and Silas waiting on the porch with a patience that was almost entirely unsuccessful. He wore a path in the porch boards. Moses Tremaine sat with him, mostly silent, occasionally saying something practical and useless the way men do in these situations. It was a boy. Dr. Fletcher came to the door and said, "You have a son. They are both well." Silas stood very still for a moment and Moses put a hand on his shoulder, and then Silas went inside. Catherine was tired in the deep specific way of new mothers, but she was fully herself, all her clear intelligence present in her eyes even through the exhaustion, and the baby was in her arms wrapped in the white blanket, very red-faced and very new and entirely unimpressed with the world so far. Silas sat on the edge of the bed, and Catherine put the baby into his arms, and he held his son with the absolute terrified tenderness of someone holding the most breakable thing they have ever been entrusted with. "What do we call him?" Catherine asked. He looked up from the baby's face. "Henry," he said. "My father's name was Henry." "Henry," she said, testing it. "Henry Weston." "Henry James Weston," Silas said. "James for your father." She looked at him. "You remembered his name." "You told me once," he said. "Last winter. You mentioned him when you were talking about the ledger system he taught you." She shook her head slightly, something full and warm moving through her expression. "Henry James Weston," she agreed. Rose was introduced to her brother that morning with great ceremony. She stood on the bed beside Catherine and regarded Henry with a concentrated expression that was pure Alina, that particular dark-eyed focus, and then she reached out and very gently patted his head and said, "Baby," with the satisfied air of a person who has correctly identified a thing. "Yes," Catherine said. "He is your brother." Rose considered this. "Mine," she said. "Yours," Silas said, and Rose appeared to find this entirely satisfactory and went back to her breakfast. Ada held Henry that afternoon and her face went somewhere private and tender, and Catherine watched her and thought of all the lives that had bent toward this point, all the choices and losses and small acts of kindness that had constructed this particular morning. The autumn of 1880 was one of the finest seasons anyone in Hollow Creek could remember. The rains had come at the right times, and the grass was good, and the cattle were fat, and Silas's purchase of the northern 50 acres had gone through, and the herd was now at 90 head, with a clear path to expansion that Moses and Silas had talked through, until both men were satisfied with the logic of it. Catherine had 4 account-keeping clients now and had begun, quietly and without announcement, teaching basic mathematics and reading to 2 of the ranch hands' children in the evenings, because there was no proper school in the valley yet and the nearest one was 7 miles east and not reliably in session. She had always meant to do something with numbers and education, she said to Silas, and he said, "I know. I could see it coming for about 2 years now," and she laughed and said, "Was it that obvious?" And he said, "Only to me," which was the right answer. The question of a school for the valley came up at the November town meeting, the way things come up in small western towns, gradually, then urgently, when enough people had been thinking the same thing separately and finally said it in the same room. Gerald Purcell brought it up, citing Catherine's informal teaching as evidence that there was both need and capability in the community. Sheriff Briggs said the county might fund a teacher's salary if the community provided a building. Several of the ranching families said they would contribute to a building fund. Catherine came home from that meeting and stood in the kitchen and said to Silas, "I think they want me to teach." "I think they want you to teach," he confirmed. "I have no formal qualification." "You can read, cipher, and think," he said, "which puts you ahead of half the trained teachers I ever had. Do you want to do it?" She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "I do." "Then do it," he said. The schoolhouse was built in the spring of 1881, a small square building with 4 windows and a solid door and a proper chalkboard that came by freight wagon from San Antonio. It held 14 students on its first day, ranging from 6 years old to 14, and Catherine Weston. She had taken his name, not because she was asked to, but because she chose to, because it was the name of the family she had built, and she wanted to wear it stood at the front of the room with chalk in her hand, and the particular feeling of someone in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, which does not come to most people very often and should be recognized when it does. Rose started school 2 years later, in 1883, when she was 5 years old, and she sat in the front row and regarded her mother with an expression of great seriousness, and not a single concession to the novelty of the situation, because Rose had always been herself with an absolute conviction that required no adjustment for circumstances. Henry, meanwhile, was 3 and already following Silas with a devotion that was both touching and inconvenient, because Silas could not take a step around the ranch without finding his son directly behind him, attempting to mirror every action. Silas bore this with immense patience and considerable amusement, and Catherine would watch them from the kitchen window and feel the particular joy of seeing a man be a good father, a real one, not a performed version of it. She talked to Rose about a leaner for the first time when Rose was 4, in 1882. She had been thinking about the right time and the right words for years, turning it over carefully, and when the moment came, it came naturally, the way the right moments often do, emerging from an ordinary afternoon rather than a prepared occasion. They were in the garden, Rose helping with the weeding in her haphazard, enthusiastic way, and Rose asked out of nowhere with the direct, unfiltered curiosity of small children, "Mama, do you have a mama?" "My mama died when I was young," Catherine said, not stopping her work. "I was 17. Rose considered this. "Do I have a mama?" she asked. Catherine sat back on her heels and looked at her daughter and said, "Yes, you have me. And before me there was a woman named Eleanor who loved you very much and who was your mother by birth." Rose looked at her with those dark, serious eyes. "Where is she?" "She went to heaven before she could stay with you," Catherine said. "She was sick. It was not anything anyone could fix." Rose turned this over. "Does she know I am here?" "I believe she does," Catherine said. "Does she know about Papa and Henry?" "I think so," Catherine said, and her throat was tight but her voice was steady. "I think she is glad about all of it." Rose nodded, apparently satisfied with this accounting, and went back to the weeding. She came back to the topic over the years, asking more as she grew, understanding differently at different ages, and Catherine answered every question with the same clear, honest directness, never softening Eleanor's story into something easier, never making the circumstances of Rose's birth something shameful, always making Eleanor herself a real full person. She told Rose about the humming, about the books, about the teaching dream, about the laugh. Rose would listen with that particular focused attention that was all Eleanor, and sometimes she would say something that was so precisely what Eleanor herself might have said that Catherine's breath would catch. When Rose was 8 and asked with the precision of an 8-year-old, "Did the man who was my birth father ever do anything good?" Catherine said, "Not that I know of. Some people do not." And Rose said, "That is all right. Papa is my father." And then she went to find Silas to help her with something in the barn, and Catherine sat with the clean, simple truth of it for a long time. By 1884, Hollow Creek had changed considerably from the small, rough settlement Catherine had stepped off the stagecoach into 6 years earlier. The railroad had come within 20 miles, which meant freight came faster and prices shifted, and people moved more freely. New families had arrived. The town had a second general store and a proper doctor's office, and a small hotel in addition to Ada's boarding house. The church that had been struck by lightning twice had finally been rebuilt properly with a proper bell tower. The school had grown too. Catherine now had 19 students, and the community was talking about expanding the schoolhouse or building a second classroom, and she had begun corresponding with the county superintendent about formalizing her position, because she had been doing this for 3 years and doing it well, and it was time it was properly recognized and properly paid. Silas's ranch was one of the most established operations in the valley by now. The herd was at 140 head, which was not the largest in the county, but was managed with a care and consistency that gave his cattle a reputation for quality that commanded a premium price at market. Moses Tremaine was his foreman now in all but formal title, and Cal Briggs had grown from the sheriff's earnest 19-year-old nephew into a confident and reliable man of 25 who had recently married and was clearly planning to stay. Ada Carmichael's health had been declining gradually since the previous winter. Her heart, Dr. Fletcher said, which was wearing in the way of old machines. Nothing sudden, just a gradual losing of efficiency. She had reduced the boarding house to 2 permanent boarders and a general open-door policy for anyone passing through who needed a bed, because she could not entirely give up the purpose of the thing even when the work had become too much. She and Catherine sat together on Sunday afternoons still, and the conversations had become more honest in the way that conversations between people who love each other become honest when there is a finite quality to the time. Ada talked about her husband, about the early years of her life in ways she never had before. Catherine talked about Ohio, about her parents, about the particular loneliness of being 17 and suddenly entirely unmoored in the world. "You were never unmoored," Ada said one Sunday with the certainty of long observation. "You were always yourself. That is not the same thing as unmoored." "It felt like it," Catherine said. "It feels like it when it is happening," Ada said. "That is how you know it is real growth rather than the performed kind. The performed kind never feels like anything at all." Ada died on a January morning in 1885 in her own bed, with Catherine holding her hand and Silas and Dr. Fletcher present. She died as she had lived, which was with a directness and dignity that made grief feel like the correct response and not an overstatement. She left the boarding house to Catherine. The will, drafted through Hollow Creek's one attorney who also handled land disputes and the occasional divorce, stated plainly that Ada Carmichael left her property, the boarding house on Main Street, to Catherine Weston, née Dawson, with the note, "Because she knew how to make a home of something, and that is what this place deserves." Catherine sat in the attorney's office with the will document in her hands, and Silas beside her, and she cried properly, for the first time since Alina, the full, wet, honest grief that she had not allowed herself in public for years, and Silas held her hand and let it be what it was. They decided, after considerable discussion, to turn the boarding house into a proper hotel, small and well-run, which Catherine managed with the same exacting care she gave to her account-keeping and her teaching. She hired a woman named Ruth Hanson to do the cooking and cleaning, a widow who had come to Hollow Creek with the railroad workers and stayed, and the arrangement worked well for both of them. The hotel did not make Catherine rich, but it made her independent in a full sense, a woman of property and enterprise in a time when that was genuinely extraordinary for someone in her circumstances. Silas said when the hotel sign went up, "Your name should be on that." "Our name is on it," she said. "Weston Hotel, our name." He looked at her. "I mean your own name, Catherine Weston's Hotel, not just Weston Hotel." She thought about it. "That might upset some people." "Good," he said mildly. She laughed and shook her head, and the sign stayed as it was, but she knew what he had meant, and the knowing mattered. Henry was 5 in 1885 and had begun at the school, where his mother taught him with a scrupulous fairness that he tested constantly, by being exactly as clever and exactly as difficult as possible, because he was Silas Weston's son and also Catherine Dawson's son, and the combination produced a child of formidable intelligence and considerable personality. Rose was 7 and had already decided she was going to be a teacher herself, or possibly a doctor. She had not fully committed. Both children knew the full story of their family. Henry knew that his sister had been born to Alina, that Catherine had brought Rose West, that their family had been built from love and promise rather than solely from blood, and he had the 8-year-old's simple conviction that this was completely normal and fine, which it was. The summer of 1885 brought the valley a drought that was the worst anyone had seen in years. The creek dropped to half its usual level, and the grass burned brown, and the cattle had to be moved regularly to find adequate grazing. It was hard work and anxious work, the kind of season that tests a ranching operation's resilience and reveals which ones have been built with enough margin for the bad years. Silas and Moses worked from before sunrise until full dark every day through June and July, moving cattle and managing water, and making the 100 decisions that a drought requires. Catherine ran the household and the hotel and the school without complaint, kept the accounts with careful attention, made sure there was always food on the table, and the children were seen to, and the work did not tip any of them over into something they could not recover from. She brought supper out to Silas in the field twice a week, a habit she had started and intended to keep. She would pack a basket and drive the small wagon out to wherever he was working, and they would eat together in the failing light with the dry grass smell around them, and the sound of the cattle and the wide sky overhead, and it was the best part of his day, and he told her so. "This is what I missed," he said once, eating cold biscuits at the edge of the south pasture with the sunset going gold and orange behind the hills. "What do you mean?" she asked. "All those years before," he said, "working alone, good enough work but alone. I missed this without knowing what I was missing." He looked at her. That is the peculiar grief of a thing you do not know to want yet. She understood exactly what he meant. "I missed it too," she said. "Ohio felt like waiting, most of it. The waiting was so long I started to mistake it for living. And now," she looked at the sunset and at her husband and at her biscuit and at the long golden grass. "Now it is actual living," she said. "The thing itself, not the waiting for it." The drought broke in August with 2 weeks of steady rain, and the valley came back green and relieved, and the cattle were all right and the ranch was all right, and Silas and Moses stood in the rain on the first day of it, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed saying. In 1886, Rose was 8 years old and asked to know everything about a leaner. Not the summarized version, not the child version, everything. She sat at the kitchen table after supper with the serious expression of someone conducting an important inquiry and said, "I am old enough now. Tell me all of it." Catherine and Silas looked at each other across the table. "All right," Catherine said, and she told her, the full version. Abilene, the laundry, Aliner's courage and Aliner's fear, and Foster Dawes and the choice Aliner had made, the death, the promise, the flight west. She told it plainly and without smoothing the difficult parts, and Rose listened with all her dark attention. When Catherine finished, Rose was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she was brave. "Yes," Catherine said. "And she chose you specifically," Rose said. "She knew you would do it right." "I tried," Catherine said. "You did," Rose said in the definitive tone of someone closing a matter. She looked at Silas. "And you did not mind, when Mama came with me." "I did not mind a single thing," Silas said. "You and your mother were the best thing that ever came to this valley." Rose nodded, satisfied. "Good," she said, and pushed back from the table and went to help Henry with something he was building in the yard, and Catherine sat at the kitchen table and pressed her hands flat on the wood and breathed carefully. Silas came around the table and put his hands on her shoulders. "She is going to be all right," he said. "I know," she said. She is so much like a leaner, the same way of deciding things, the same way of just looking straight at what is hard and saying, right, that is what it is." "Is that terrible to see?" "No," she said. "It is the opposite of terrible." She reached up and covered his hand with hers. "It is like she is still here, through Rose." He leaned down and pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she closed her eyes. By 1887, Hollow Creek had a proper school board, and Catherine was its first formally appointed teacher, with a salary and an official certificate that the county superintendent sent by mail with a letter commending her 3 years of informal service and 6 years of formal teaching. She hung the certificate in the schoolhouse where the students could see it, because she had opinions about what was worth displaying in a classroom. The ranch was thriving. The herd was at 160 head, and the northern 50 acres had been fully integrated into the operation. Moses Tremaine had finally accepted the formal title of foreman, which he had been avoiding out of a characteristically stubborn humility for years. And Cal Briggs had expanded his responsibilities and was being groomed, openly and with his knowledge, to eventually take on a senior role. The hotel was well established and had a reputation along the Western Road as a clean and well-run establishment, which in 1887 was not as common as one would hope and therefore meant something. And then Catherine told Silas she was expecting again. Henry was 7 and Rose was 9, and neither of them had been expecting another addition, or rather, had stopped actively expecting one. And Silas sat with this news on the porch in the September evening, with the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of how much good could actually accumulate in a life. "We are going to need the back room," he said, eventually. "We are going to need the back room," she agreed. The baby was born in April of 1888. A girl this time, born in the spring with the bluebonnets running across the lower pasture for the third time, and the creek full and bright. She was born with Catherine's brown hair and Silas's dark eyes, and she came into the world with a voice that made Dr. Fletcher say she clearly intended to be heard, and everyone present agreed. They named her Alina. It was Rose's idea. She had come to her parents 2 weeks before the birth with that dark-eyed directness and said, "I think the baby should be named Alina, if you agree." She looked at her mother. "So she keeps being here." Catherine had been unable to speak for a moment. Silas said, "I think that is exactly right." So she was Alina Weston, and she came home to the ranch house in Silas's arms, and Henry examined her with the suspicious interest of an older brother. And Rose held her with the practiced confidence of a 9-year-old who had been helping with babies since she could remember. And the valley was green, and the ranch was sound, and Hollow Creek was a real town now with real roots. And Catherine stood in the doorway of the ranch house watching her family in the spring light, and she thought of Alina Page, who had hummed while she worked and wanted to be a teacher, and had loved her baby daughter with the whole of her brief life. She thought that this was what it meant to keep a promise. Not just the immediate rescue of it, the flight west with the infant in a flour sack blanket, but the long, sustained work of love that turns a promise into a life, that takes what could have been a loss and makes it instead a continuation, a carrying forward. She thought that somewhere, in whatever place good people go when they leave the world too early, Alina Page knew that her daughter was loved and known, and growing up fierce and curious and absolutely herself, and that the woman she had trusted with her most important thing had built something real around it, something that would hold. She thought of herself on that stagecoach, jaw set and eyes telling a different story, stepping down into the dust of Hollow Creek with everything she owned and everything she had promised to protect. And she thought of the man who had watched from the porch of the feed store and who had, without being asked and without condition, placed himself between her and whatever was coming. And she thought that love in its truest form is not the dramatic declaration, but the 10,000 small acts of choosing, day after day, that builds something permanent from what could have been temporary. Silas came up behind her and put his hands on her waist and his chin on her shoulder, and they stood together in the doorway looking at their children, Rose and Henry sitting on the porch steps, the baby between them, Henry making faces that were producing the most extraordinary sounds from little Alina, Rose conducting some kind of investigation of the baby's fingers. And the afternoon light was the particular gold of late April, the best light of the year. And the valley stretched out before them wide and green. "Silas," she said. He said against her hair. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night, in the kitchen, when I told you about Alina and Rose?" he thought. "I said you were the person who showed up." "You said that is what a mother is," she said, "the person who shows up." "I stand by it," he said. "I have been thinking," she said slowly, "that it is also what love is, the showing up, not the feeling which is easy but the actual being there, the daily choosing of it." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him thinking the way she had learned to feel it, the particular quality of his silences. "Yes," he said finally, "that is exactly what it is." Rose looked up from her examination of Alina's fingers and caught her parents in the doorway, and gave them the particular look of a 9-year-old who finds parental affection simultaneously touching and undignified, and called out, "Come and see. She is holding my finger by herself." And they went, both of them, because that is what you do when a child calls you to witness something new. And little Eleanor held Rose's finger with the fierce, concentrated grip of someone who has already decided that the world is worth holding onto. And Henry leaned over and said, with a seriousness borrowed entirely from his father, "She is going to be strong." And Rose said, "She is already strong." And Catherine and Silas stood over their 3 children in the April light and knew, with a certainty that required no further evidence, that everything had been worth it. Every mile of the road west, every new town and new name and careful step, every difficult thing carried alone before it could be shared, every moment of fear and every act of stubbornness, and every small, brave choice that had led to this one. The valley held the light a little longer, the way valleys do, cupping it in green and gold before releasing it to the dark. And in Hollow Creek the lamps were beginning to come on in the windows of the houses along Main Street, and somewhere up the road Ada Carmichael's hotel was open and lit, and the school sat quiet and prepared for Monday, and the ranch stretched east across its 160 acres of grass and water and hard-won purpose. And on the porch of the ranch house, 3 children and 2 people who had found each other in the particular way that only happens when both parties have already been shaped by enough hardship to recognize what is real and choose it without reservation. Those 5 people were a family in the fullest possible sense, made not from a single story but from several, braided together into something that would hold. Years later, when Rose Weston was a grown woman with her own students and her own life, she would tell people that she had 2 mothers, both of whom had loved her absolutely, one of whom she had never met in life, and one of whom had carried her west through the hard country in a flour sack blanket and built her a home from scratch. She would say it without grief and without apology, and with a clarity that came from having been told the truth clearly from the very beginning. And when people asked about her father, she would say, with Eleanor's particular direct dark-eyed look, that some men hear a difficult thing and look for the nearest exit, and some men hear a difficult thing and say that does not change a single thing, and the kind of man who says that is the only kind worth knowing. Henry would grow into a man who looked like his father and thought like his mother, and had the particular stubborn integrity of someone who had grown up watching both parents choose the harder right thing over the easier wrong one, day after day, until it became simply the way a person was. Eleanor, little Eleanor, fierce from her first breath, would become a teacher, which would not surprise anyone, and she would name her own daughter Catherine, which would make a woman of 54 sit very still in her kitchen and press her hands flat on the old familiar table and breathe carefully against the fullness of it. But that was later. On this April evening in 1888, the only thing that was happening was this: a family on a porch, in a valley that held the light, in a life that had been built from a promise kept, and a love that had said from the very beginning that does not change a single thing. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every way that mattered, everything.